Imagine a world where a simple cough could be a death sentence, a world where half the population vanished, not in the fires of war, but in a wave of sickness and terror. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how the Middle Ages truly ended, not with a bang, but with a whisper of fear that consumed a continent. In the 14th century, no king, no knight, no priest could stop what was coming. It wasn't an army that brought Europe to its knees. It was something so small, you couldn't even see it. It arrived silently on ships, carried by unsuspecting merchants and their tiny, unwelcome passengers. This is the story of the day the Middle Ages first learned true fear. This is the story of the Black Death. It began in the East. A distant rumor whispered along the Silk Road, stories of a terrible pestilence that left entire cities desolate. But for Europeans busy with their own wars and commerce, it was just a far-off tale. They had no idea that this story was sailing towards them, carried across the Black Sea to the bustling port of Kafkas in Crimea. In 1346, the city was under siege by the Mongol army, but the besiegers started falling ill with a mysterious sickness. Buboes, fever, delirium, then death. In a desperate, horrifying act of biological warfare, the Mongol general ordered the bodies of his dead soldiers to be catapulted over the city walls. The defenders of Kaffa had repelled the army, but they had welcomed a far deadlier enemy. The plague was now inside Europe's gates. From Kaffa, it was only a matter of time. Genoese merchants, fleeing the besieged city, didn't know they were carrying the disease with them. Their ships became floating coffins, arriving in the great ports of Messina, Genoa, and Venice, with crews either dead or dying. The authorities tried to quarantine the ships, turning them away, but it was too late. The rats and the fleas they carried had already scurried ashore. The initial reaction was confusion. What was this disease? It started with a fever and aches. Then came the telltale sign: swollen, painful lumps in the armpits, neck, and groin. They called them buboes, from which the bubonic plague gets its name. These would turn black as the tissue died, giving the plague its more infamous name, the Black Death. For most, death was swift and agonizing, coming within a week. The plague didn't just kill. It shattered the very fabric of medieval society. It changed how people saw life, death, and even God. Imagine entire villages vanishing overnight, whole families erased from the pages of history as if they never existed. Streets that were once filled with the sounds of life. Children playing, merchants haggling, craftsmen working, fell eerily silent, filled only with the smell of fear and decay. The sheer scale of death was unimaginable. In cities like Florence, chroniclers wrote that the dead were piled up in the streets like lasagna, layered between thin coverings of dirt. The bells, which once tolled for every funeral, eventually stopped ringing. There were simply too many dead, and often no one left alive to ring them. Some said it was a punishment from God, a divine reckoning for humanity's sins. Processions of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in a desperate public penance, hoping to appease an angry deity. Others believed it was the work of the devil walking among men, or that the air itself had been poisoned. Superstition ran rampant. Doctors, powerless against the unseen killer, resorted to desperate measures. They wore strange bird-like masks with long beaks stuffed with herbs and flowers, believing it would protect them from the miasma, the bad air they thought caused the disease. These plague doctors became terrifying symbols of the time, harbingers of death, because even they were afraid to breathe the same air as the dying. But that was only the beginning. The plague was relentless. It didn't stop at one kingdom or one city. It followed the trade routes, spreading like wildfire across the continent. From Italy, it crawled north into France, Spain, and England. It traveled by ship to Ireland and Scandinavia. No mountain range or sea could halt its advance. Even the rich and powerful, who tried to escape to their country estates, discovered a terrifying truth. Death travels faster than gold. The plague was the great equalizer. It struck down the peasant in the field and the noble in his castle with equal ferocity. King Alfonso VII of Castile died from it. The daughter of the English king, Edward III, succumbed on her way to her wedding in Spain. The old feudal order, built on land and lineage, began to crumble as lords died without heirs and peasants found their labor suddenly in high demand. As the death toll mounted, faith itself began to die. The church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, promised salvation and comfort, but prayers went unanswered. Priests, who were expected to give last rites to the dying, often fled in terror or became victims themselves. The institution that held all the answers was suddenly, terrifyingly powerless. People's faith was shaken to its core. If God was good, why would he allow such suffering? If the church was his representative on earth, why couldn't it stop the dying? This crisis of faith would plant the seeds of dissent that would eventually blossom into the Reformation over a century later. The world was being remade, forged in the crucible of pestilence and doubt. The social order was turned upside down. With a third to a half of Europe's population gone, labor became scarce. For the first time, surviving peasants and laborers had bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better conditions. Many left the manors they were tied to, seeking new opportunities in depopulated towns. This newfound economic freedom for the lower classes terrified the aristocracy, who tried to impose wage freezes and force people back to work. But you can't argue with supply and demand. These tensions boiled over into violent uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt in England. The rigid, hierarchical world of the Middle Ages was breaking apart, not by design, but by the sheer random chaos of disease. Art and culture became obsessed with mortality. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life. Popes, kings, merchants, and peasants to their graves. It was a stark reminder that death comes for everyone. Literature from the period, like Boccaccio's The Decameron, captures the psychological impact. A group of young nobles flee plague-ridden Florence and tell stories to pass the time, trying to create a bubble of normalcy in a world gone mad. The trauma was etched into the collective consciousness of Europe, a scar that would last for generations. The optimism of the High Middle Ages was gone, replaced by a darker, more cynical worldview. In just a few short years, the Black Death had redrawn the map of Europe, not in terms of borders, but in terms of people, power, and belief. The Middle Ages didn't collapse in a glorious war between kings and empires. They drowned in their own fear, suffocated by an invisible enemy that no one understood. The Black Death didn't just take lives, it killed an entire era. It accelerated the end of feudalism, challenged the authority of the church, and forever changed the relationship between the living and the dead. On that day, the plague first arrived. The medieval world, with its certainties of God and social order, finally knew fear, and it would never be the same again. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of history's most transformative events.